Welcome to a new unit of the class. For the rest of the semester, we're going to be talking about how we can decarbonize our economy. This is critical to tackling climate change. We really have to find a way to maintain an economy that can provide enough jobs for everybody, hopefully some degree of equity, and provide jobs that are meaningful, fulfilling for everyone. Some of the things we're going to have to tackle are our energy infrastructure, how we use land, the way we connect people through transportation, and in many developed high-income countries, but especially in the United States, things are going to be made more difficult because of decisions we've made in the past. That's why I've entitled this lecture, Escaping from the Past. And important topic henceforth is going to be the notion of path dependencies and how we break out of them. So let's start out by talking about what is a path dependency. So a path dependency is basically you do something because you have a commitment to doing it in the past. You've built infrastructure, or you just feel comfortable doing it because that's the way you've done things in the past, and society is resistant to change. The most important part of path dependencies are those where there's a lot of infrastructure in place already, where there are important assets that people don't want to lose or see devalued. These are going to be the ones that represent the greatest challenge. So as I mentioned, this is especially true when it comes to looking at our energy supply. We are partly trapped by decisions we've made in the past. I'm going to spend the coming lecture looking at those decisions to see, you need to understand them to see what needs to be. And we're also going to eventually look at urban planning and see how, especially the United States, but also some other countries are really sort of locked in by past decisions that make it harder to reboot. So I mentioned the term stranded asset. This is a term that you should be familiar with. It's something that has value, but could lose some or all of its value if society changes the way it's doing things or changes technology. From an energy perspective, it's estimated that there are $30 trillion worth of fossil fuels in the ground. A lot of those fossil fuels have owners. Owners can include governments like Iran and Venezuela, or shareholders of publicly traded companies like Exxon. So the importance of stranded assets is that it can prevent creative destruction. If you remember our talk of economic schools of thought, Joseph Schumpeter mentioned that what's really important about capitalism is this dynamic nature it creates of constant innovation, where new ideas, new technologies are rising up and destroying old ways of doing things and old technologies. However, when that old way of doing things is incredibly powerful, it's not going to go down without a fight. And we're going to look at in this lecture how these path dependencies we've created are making it more difficult for creative destruction to rule in the present. So I want to go all the way back to the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. If you're bored at home right now and you want to watch a good movie, you should watch The Current War, which actually deals with this. So back in the 1890s, the first few years of the 20th century, George Westinghouse and Thomas Edison were involved in this really dramatic fight. It seems kind of petty now over whether the grid should be AC or DC power, but at the time, the media was all in, and this became a huge PR relations battle. It became very personal. George Westinghouse was joined by Nikola Tesla, and on Thomas Edison's side, you had J.P. Morgan, each betting big on the future of which type of current would um, rule the grid. And let me say a little bit about what the two sides really were about. Even though we look at Thomas Edison often as a visionary, when it came to electricity, he kind of missed the boat. Thomas Edison and J.P. Morgan thought that electricity was always going to be this kind of niche resource, that wealthy people would use electricity to have lighting at night, basically extend daylight hours for a few hours. And because they didn't see the true potential of electricity, they thought the best way to create the grid was to have a collection of mini grids that would be located near the users and would provide them with energy. Westinghouse and Tesla had a more complete vision. They understood that electricity was this revolutionary force that was going to change our economy. They believed the way to go was AC power, because AC power, you can build large power plants, ship those electrons from far away, and you lose a lot less energy along the route than you do with DC. At the time, DC energy was not very good for transmission. It lost a lot of its energy, a lot of its electrons along the route. So for it to work, the power plants had to be near where people lived. Well, this battle raged on for almost a decade. Thomas Edison, one of his main points was that AC power wasn't safe, that you could get electrocuted. Actually, you can get electrocuted from DC energy too. So it was kind of a weird point, but he took to electrocuting animals, including a poor elephant named Topsy that was electrocuted in 1903 in this big kind of festival-like environment. People came to see this poor elephant get fried. George Westinghouse eventually wins the battle, and he deserved to win the battle. However, technology's been changing rapidly. I'll explain in a moment why today we'd be better off having a grid that is mostly DC rather than AC. However, we've invested a lot in our AC grid in many countries that electrified earlier, and it's not easy to just go back and change everything from one type of current to another. That would be really expensive. You'd have to throw away a lot of investment in infrastructure. See the current war. Sometimes it's portrayed as Edison versus Westinghouse, sometimes Edison versus Tesla, but as far as who was in charge, Tesla was working for Westinghouse. Tesla and George Westinghouse built the first hydroelectric power plant in Niagara Falls, and this really started the electrification of the world. It was a large power plant shipping power out to further away destinations. This was inaugurated in 1897. The battle continued for many years, 6, 7 years longer, but in hindsight, this was the beginning of the end for the AC-DC battle. With the building of this power plant, AC really became the winner. I'm not going to read this speech by Tesla. You can read it, but Tesla, you can see, unlike Edison, who thought of electricity in a very limited way, understood the power of electricity, how electricity was going to transform society. And we take electricity for granted, but if you think about it, we depend on it for everything. Imagine taking away electricity and how that would transform our lives. Tesla, more than 120 years ago, understood how electricity was poised to transform life in the coming century. All right, I want to switch now, and I want to talk about another important individual who really put his stamp on our electric system. Put it on a major way that we still are having trouble changing what Samuel Insull was responsible for creating. Just a little bit about Samuel Insull. Samuel Insull was born in Great Britain. He was a poor man, but he was recognized for his brilliance. Um, Somebody who was working for Thomas Edison happened to meet him in Great Britain and recognized his ability, and it was arranged for him to be brought to the United States, where he worked as Edison's personal secretary for a while. He began to rise through the ranks of Edison Electric, now General Electric, and at one point he was the head of the big manufacturing plant in Schenectady, New York at the time. It's one of the biggest manufacturing plants in the world. Essentially he had almost 90,000 people working for him. This made it really shocking when Samuel Insull decided to take a job as the head of a small utility in Chicago. You might be thinking, wait a minute, that's a great job to be the head of something like Duke Energy. But back then, there were no big utility companies. Chicago had 32 utilities, and Insull went from having tens of thousands of people reporting to him to having a staff of about 30. The reason that Insull took this job, though, was he had a vision. He also had a vision. He had a vision for what an electric company could look like. And he executed his idea remarkably. So the first thing you have to know is that if you go back to big cities like Chicago and New York, you go back 110 years, they were a mess. Wires were running everywhere overhead. You think about 32 electric companies competing for customers, they all have to have their own wires. Then it gets even more comical in that they're all producing different currents, and you have different appliances that are running on their current. So let's say you were having a large house party and you needed more lamps. You probably couldn't go across the street and borrow lamps from your neighbor because those lamps would run on a different current. Part of what made electricity really expensive also was because electricity production was being turned on when people were getting off of work at night. And the idea was you were extending daylight hours, providing electricity for lighting for a short number of hours every evening. And it's very expensive to turn even a small power plant on and run it for just a few hours. Often something like a coal plant might take an hour or so to reach efficiency. So we're going to talk about load curves later on, but electricity in this period had a very peculiar load curve. Most utilities, let's say in the summer, were turning their electricity on around 6 when people came home, keeping it on maybe till 10 or 11, and then basically the demand for electricity went away. One of the things that Insull realized was that there was also another major producer of electricity in Chicago at the time, and it was the trolley companies. They had a very different load curve. They were producing electricity to run their trolleys mostly in the daytime. When people went home, there was no more demand for the trolleys. Trolley companies did try to extend demand by trying to keep people out later. Around the turn of the century, 19th to 20th century, they developed a lot of amusement parks like Coney Island with the goal of essentially keeping people out later so that they could keep their trolleys running later. Well, Insull's great insight was that if you could combine the two types of electric uses and producers, you could run power plants more efficiently by running them at higher capacity for most of the day. So he went to the trolley companies and offered them electricity at a price that was cheaper than what they could produce. And of course, they thought that was a great deal and went along with him. So Insull, by building up economies of scale, was able to knock his competitors out. Was able to produce electricity at a price that was so cheap, those other 31 companies couldn't compete. So Insull developed basically a monopoly within Chicago. However, Insull's appetite was not whetted. He wanted to get bigger. As he tried to expand outside of Chicago, he ran into the corruption of the era. This is right around the time of again, in the early part of the 20th century, when there's a lot of corruption in government, especially in local governments. It's what you call, at the time, a cash and carry system. And it was one of the things that produced the progressive era reaction that demanded cleaner government where people were hired and maintained their job based on merit. And Insull was being met with a lot of difficulties as he tried to expand his business out of Chicago. Local governments, in exchange for giving him the right-of-way, essentially had to be bribed in a major way. And this was extremely inefficient. So this is where Insull leaves his stamp on the American electricity scene. He develops the natural monopoly model, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. He also, in accordance with this when you create, the state decides it's going to allow monopolies instead of competition, it has to create regulatory bodies, which we call public utility commissions, in order to protect the public interests against monopoly pricing. These public utility commissions exist in most of our states today. I mean, they exist in all states, but in most states, they still exist in the same form as they did about 100 years ago. Very limited mandate. They basically determine in a state like North Carolina what the monopolist, which is Duke Energy, can or cannot do. Unfortunately, in their mandate, there's nothing about environmental quality. There's nothing about decarbonizing the environment. They're limited essentially to looking out for the public interest to make sure the public doesn't pay too much for electricity. It's a very limited mandate that is really tying our hands today. The second thing, and we'll talk about related to this, is that these regulatory bodies, these public utility commissions, developed what is called the cost recovery model for energy pricing. It's the idea that utilities, as they build infrastructure, should be able to build this into their price model so that they have enough to cover the cost of the infrastructure plus their financing and a modest profit. And this cost recovery model encourages stakeholders, utilities, Public Utilities Commission, to look at grid balance always as a supply rather than a demand issue. So if you need more electricity, don't incur at 5 o'clock in the evening during the month of August. Don't encourage people to use less at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Just build a new power plant so you can meet demand in the summertime in North Carolina for an hour or two. That's what this model has kind of encouraged. Nobody thought of it back then, but that is what it has done. It also created a larger role for the states in energy planning. Today we have a confusing patchwork of what's in the domain of the federal government and what's in the domain of the states. As we move through the energy transition, there are going to be bitter fights between the federal government and the states. And again, this goes back to the system that Samuel Insull helped create. One other thing he did that collapsed for a while in the Depression was he created this holding company model. And this allowed one company to own various utilities, so one company could be involved in multiple states. When his company collapsed during the Great Depression, he was pillared for, losing people's money, and he was even brought up for trial. He was acquitted. But what did come out of this in the Great Depression was the holding company model was outlawed. We eventually weakened regulation. So if you look at consolidation today, we have holding companies again. So for example, a Southern company owns utilities in various southeastern states. Uh, Duke Energy owns utilities in North Carolina, Indiana, Florida. So we've kind of moved a little bit back towards that model, at least in parts of the country. So what is a natural monopoly? It's the idea that a specific market can be best met by limiting the number of producers and sellers to one, that this can provide better quality at a lower price. And if you think about that, that makes sense 100 years ago, that if one entity controlled all the wires, could build a very large power plant, that customers would get better, cheaper service. So you have 32 utilities in Chicago running wires all over the place with lots of little power plants. Customers are going to pay more for inferior service. So a key point is, I'm not saying that Insull did anything wrong. On the contrary, he was a wise man, and what he was promoting made sense, not just for himself, but for society at the time. But things do change. I also want to point out that not everybody agreed with Insull. Today, Senator Bernie Sanders is advocating that the way to tackle climate change is for the federal government to nationalize the utilities. I don't agree with that. That's not usually the best way to promote innovation. But what I do want to highlight that's important is, back in the 1920s, there was a big battle that went on, and that went on into the 30s. And interestingly, it was led by Republicans at the time. Republicans led by, at least a group of Republicans led by Senator George Norris of Nebraska, thought electricity was too important to be left into the domain of the private sector, that electricity should be controlled by the government. George Norris's side lost out, but not without some triumphs that also have left their mark until today. The federal government during the 1930s did get heavily involved in the electricity business. The Tennessee Valley Authority is an example of that involvement, where the federal government built a series of hydroelectric dams, created a utility for one of the poorest regions of the country at the time, and continues to own and run that utility today. There are a number of other federally controlled utilities in the western part of the country. So if we look today at the ownership of our electric infrastructure, it's a bit of a patchwork, although it's consolidating a bit. So in 1998, we had 239 investor-owned utilities. These are utilities that have shareholders. Duke Energy, Dominion, Southern Company are examples of investor-owned utilities. One of the things I want to point out is that with the ability to have holding companies again, we're seeing consolidation. So we've gone from 239 companies in 20 years, we went to 168 companies. I don't have figures for the past few years, but probably the number is even below 168. If you'll look at the percentages, back in 1998, we got 74% of our electricity in terms of retail sales were produced by these investor-owned utilities. Today, it's 72%. So they still account for the great share of retail sales. Now, who are the other players? And they're not all accounted for here, and I'll explain who the other players are that are not accounted. So we also have publicly owned utilities. I mentioned Tennessee Valley Authority as an example of that, but we also have municipal owned utilities. Places like Los Angeles, Sacramento, Gainesville, Florida, Boulder, Colorado, own and operate their own utilities. And there are many other smaller towns in the country that also run their own own electric utility. There are also at least 900 rural cooperatives that are responsible for about 8.6% of retail sales. One of the things about rural cooperatives and also a lot of publicly owned utilities is often they don't produce any, or at least definitely not all of the electricity they sell. They're often buying it from investor-owned utilities. Rural cooperatives essentially operate in places investor-owned utilities didn't want to go because they weren't profitable. A rural cooperative is member-owned, so profit is not the motive. They try best to serve the needs of their customer, and because of that, they're also very innovative these days, especially when it comes to things like promoting energy efficiency. The most innovative programs we've seen are coming out of these rural cooperatives. Roanoke Electric Cooperative, which is mentioned in the program you're going to watch on energy poverty, is considered a national leader when it comes to innovation. Right now, I want to take a look at how the grid developed in the US. So again, looking at the past and how we're kind of stuck in the past, the US actually doesn't have a single grid. It has 3 grids, an eastern, western, and one that covers most of Texas. These grids are not connected and they cannot share energy. During the Obama administration, there was a plan to connect the 3 grids called Tres Amigas in New Mexico. And there was a lot of opposition to it. It didn't get funding. Now, you might ask, why is this important? As we try and build out renewables, it's really important to be able to ship resources like solar and wind power from one part of the country to the other. Texas produces a huge excess of wind power, and be very good if you could ship some of that to places, big load centers, to places like Phoenix, Los Angeles, but can't do that unless the grids are connected. Baseload power plants is a term that you should know. This is kind of the old model where you have something. Baseload refers to the minimum amount of energy you need throughout the year, what lowest point in demand, that's considered the base. And typically we've created baseload power by burning coal. And a lot of people have argued that we can't have a grid based on renewable energy because renewables can't do baseload. That's pretty much been debunked, but you still see that argument used a lot. Peak load plants are plants that provide, when you have spikes in demand, either seasonally or daily, they are plants that turn on to meet that extra demand. Typically, they're old, inefficient gas plants and sometimes coal plants, and they're very expensive to use. So if a baseload power is producing electricity at 3 cents a kilowatt hour, turning these peak load plants on, they're often producing at like 30 to 40 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's important because when we, for example, in North Carolina, pay for electricity, we're paying an average price. Paying usually, in Chapel Hill, you're probably paying about 11.5 cents a kilowatt hour. That reflects the average of the price of the baseload and the peaker plants. The problem by paying a fixed price is it gives nobody an incentive not to come home in the summer, 5:30 in the afternoon, and jack up the AC, turn on the dishwasher, the washing machine. If people paid a price that reflected the true cost of energy at that time, it would affect how people use energy, and it would mean that we wouldn't have to turn on these inefficient gas plants to meet peak demand. Load profiles and load management, we'll talk about how the cost recovery model, or we mentioned the cost recovery model. So what that has done is, traditionally when there are, let's say, a few hours, even a year, where demand peaks, the utility company has an incentive to go out and produce new infrastructure to meet that demand. So that's what's called a supply-based approach, rather than using a demand-based approach, where you could charge people more for using electricity at that time. That would help lower the peak, and it would mean that new infrastructure isn't needed. This is a tool that most states do not have, and it makes the use of electricity a lot more inefficient. I just want to go over a few terms: substations, transformers. So these are where electricity, the voltage is, you have very high voltage running through the lines, and when it goes to a substation where voltage is being lowered so it can be used in businesses and residential houses. So in terms of distribution, you have two types of lines. You have transmission lines. These are high voltage lines that are used to carry currents longer distances, and distribution lines, which are lower voltage lines, which are used to carry electricity directly to consumers. All right, so I want to go over, we've talked about these, but kind of pull it together, elements of our current infrastructure from an administrative perspective. First of all, you have a Public Utilities Commission with their limited mandate. They use this cost recovery model for the monopolist, allowing a company like Duke to build more infrastructure if it's deemed necessary, and then to raise the prices to not only recover their costs, but make a modest profit on their investment. We've got a division of power between the states and the federal government that's a bit unclear. It allows states often to block important projects like high voltage lines moving from west to east. And we have, in most states, we have a vertically integrated system. So take North Carolina. Duke Energy owns most of the power generating capacity, the transmission lines, and the distribution lines. They are a monopolist. If you live in Chapel Hill, you cannot shop around for where you're going to get electricity. And this is true in North Carolina and in most, but no longer all states. Some states like Texas, notably, the first one, but also now to a degree California, New York. Several states have moved to try to deregulate their electric system. So I mentioned earlier that we have not one grid, but three grids. Here you can picture the three grids. Now, I also want to go back when we're talking about the grid and current. I mentioned in the beginning that it was the right thing that Westinghouse prevailed over Edison in the current wars. Where we have a path dependency today is that DC current for many things makes more sense. First of all, transmission lines. Today, actually, high voltage DC current lines are the most efficient way to move electrons long distance. If you were going to move wind power from the Great Plains to load centers east and west, you would do that with high voltage DC lines. Also, if you look at a house, let's take a house that wants to be as zero net energy as possible. This house has solar panels on the roof. It's trying to power its appliances as much as possible off those solar panels. Well, those solar panels are producing a DC current. And that current has to go to an inverter where it's converted to AC power. A significant amount of energy is wasted in the switching over from DC to AC power. And that would be fine, except now, as that electricity moves into the house, more and more of our gadgets actually use DC power. Anything running in your house with a chip is using DC power. So think about your computer. it also has something inside of it that allows it to convert from AC power back to DC power. Increasingly, most of our household appliances are going to be smart appliances that are going to require DC power. Good example of that is today in commercial buildings, most of the lighting now is solid state. It's a very efficient form of lighting, but it also uses DC power. So today, if we were going to power our homes, the most efficient way to do it would be with DC power. You'd have a lot less wasted electricity. But we have built this very expensive grid that's based on AC power. We are seeing a hybrid system develop where we do have high voltage DC current lines, nothing like China has. China has high voltage DC lines all over the place. And we're starting to see some new modern buildings that are kind of hybrid buildings that might have DC aspects like the lighting and AC aspects. I'm hoping that we'll get to do an interview later on with Luis Sao, who works for Cisco. And Cisco just helped build a new hotel in Fort Worth, Texas, that is almost entirely DC powered. So beginning to see a slow switchover, but given how much we've invested in our infrastructure, we're going to have AC current around for a long period of time. So we've talked a little bit about the problem with having peak loads, that utilities end up sinking big money into power plants that run only a small percentage of the time. They can't run efficiently, and often utilities use like their weakest assets to provide the peak. So aging gas plants that are really not running on the best technology, old coal plants, so they're very dirty. There are alternatives now. Many people beginning to see where we could use energy storage to help provide the peak. And the moment those storage is still somewhat expensive, except for pumped hydro, that it would require some state level mandate for that to happen. And I mentioned this already, that investor-owned utilities have always dealt with peaks by just adding more capacity. So you have a few weeks of the year where you need a little more electricity towards the end of the day in summer in North Carolina to run air conditioners. You build a new power plant, you move a plant that formerly provided base load to peak load, and that's a good way to stick with fossil fuels, and it's very inefficient. Tackling it from a demand side would be a lot more efficient. I want to introduce a new term, which is dispatchable energy sources. So when you have big swings in energy demand, you need a kind of energy form that you can rev up and down. And problem is most carbon-free energy sources like wind, solar, and nuclear are not very dispatchable. You would think nuclear could be, but for the most part, it just kind of has a lot of characteristics of baseload. It doesn't respond very quickly to changes in the need for electricity or decreases in the need for electricity. You can't rev a nuclear plant up or down very quickly. And as a result, utilities argue they're going to have to continue to rely a lot on natural gas, because natural gas is a great dispatchable source of energy. You can turn modern gas plants up and down relatively easy compared to the alternatives. When it comes to dispatchable sources of energy that are clean, stored energy, which except for pumped hydro is pretty expensive still, even though prices are coming down fast, and one can see a day coming in the next few years when it might be cheaper to use batteries rather than gas peaker plants. Hydroelectric is also dispatchable. Of course, droughts can limit that dispatchability. And bioenergy also has attributes of being dispatchable. However, these options are limited or still expensive. Limited, we're not going to build a lot of large hydroelectric plants. We can build some run-of-the-river hydro, but that has limitations, and it's not cheap, and bioenergy is still relatively expensive. So we talked about demand-side solutions. These require peak time pricing, the ability to charge people, consumers, a different amount based on the time of the day when they use electricity. For real-time pricing to work, you have to have smart appliances, consumers willing to take control over their energy use. So for example, the ability to program your washing machine to turn on when electricity prices go below a certain point. We're moving towards that world, and in deregulated markets like Texas, consumers usually do at least have the option of going with real-time pricing. An example that was in the New York Times about 2 years ago was a company that was selling electricity, had a lot of wind energy in its portfolio, was giving people electricity for free from 9 in the evening till 6 in the morning. During the day, electricity was pretty expensive, but they interviewed people who were signing up for that company and included, for example, graduate students who would stay away from their apartment till 9 in the evening, and they would come home then and use all the free electricity. I also want to go over the US energy mix over time. So this is an important fact. It's important to note that coal, and if you look at where we are with coal today, less than 24%, I think it's right at 24% of our electric grid is, the energy is being produced by coal. Now, if you compare that with just about 12 years ago, we were getting about half of our electricity from coal. Now, what's important here is if you want to mislead people, for example, about electric cars, saying that electric cars are just as dirty as oil, you can write a paper based on real data. You just pick an old data point. Pick a time like 2005 when about half of our energy was coming from coal power. And you can make it look like, at least in parts of the country, it's worse to drive an electric car than an oil car. That's no longer true anywhere because coal usage has plummeted to such a degree. So one of the things that you need to pay attention to in the energy world when you look at data is when and where does that data come from? People often deliberately mislead the public, and they are paid for by people with deep pockets to do so. So for example, if I want to convince you that renewable energy is a bad idea that's going to destroy the economy, and I want you to think I'm using data, I just have to go back to the previous decade, pick a data point like 2003, and I would shock you and make you think that renewable energy is a really bad idea. But the bottom line is the price of renewable energy has been plummeting for the past 40 years. And anybody that feeds you old data is trying to mislead you. So keep this energy picture in mind. People like to blame government for the decline of coal, saying that we've subsidized renewable energy. And actually, I'm not going to get deep into subsidies, but renewable energy has never gotten the level of subsidies that fossil fuels and nuclear have gotten. And with regards to knocking coal offline, it hasn't just been renewables, it's also been natural gas combined cycle plants have played a major role in eating coal's lunch. So it's not government. On the contrary, President Trump has been doing everything to make coal face more favorable conditions. He's removed just about every environmental restriction that was based on trying to make coal absorb some of its negative externalities. and coal still can't compete. So this is data from the past year, and you can see that renewable energy is actually, if you include hydro and renewable energy, is actually becoming as important or more important than coal when it comes to providing electricity for the grid. Right, I want to now discuss what a deregulated market looks like. Many of you who believe in markets, who consider yourself conservative, strangely often don't consider the fact that this is not a free market. A monopoly is not competitive, it's not a market. Forces don't prevail when you have a monopolist. This is why Texas, when George Bush was still governor of Texas, moved towards deregulating the market. So what does a deregulated market look like? You still have one regulated entity. It could be a utility or nonprofit entity or a government agency that runs the grid. There's no profit in running the grid. And again, you don't want to get back to a system where wires are going everywhere. So transmission lines have to be operated by a single entity. But then you can have electric distribution companies. So instead of just having one choice, you can have many choices, and you could choose based on price, you could choose based on flexibility. So maybe you want an offer where you pay real-time pricing. Maybe you're really concerned about climate change and you want to get your energy from a company that's going to promise you it's sourcing just from renewable sources. So in a place like Texas, people have choice. And then you have actually generation companies, different companies that are producing energy and interacting in a market setting to sell their energy. And you can even have companies that are not even producing energy, but are aggregating energy from different distributed sources, solar power plants, wind power plants. This is what's known as a virtual power plant. It's an integrator of different distributed energy sources. So one of the attributes of a deregulated market that makes it unattractive is that when you deregulate the market, initially prices go up because there's not a lot of competition. But as time progresses, competition occurs, innovation occurs, and prices go down. And this is exactly what we've seen occur in Texas. But not every example has ended in success. California is a long story. They didn't completely deregulate. They partially deregulated soon after Texas. And the partial deregulation was their downfall. It allowed for companies to game the system and produce very high rates. And it actually brought down a governor and a recall. And for a long time, that put a chill across all the states when they thought about deregulation. But slowly, some states are beginning to pick the ball back up and are moving towards deregulation. In North Carolina, we actually have 2 Republican House members in Raleigh who are looking at least some ways to begin to deregulate the market. Now, you might say, why is this important for clean energy when you have a situation like we have today, when if you strip away subsidies, solar and wind are often the cheapest options out there. I mean, coal would disappear extremely fast in a deregulated market. It wouldn't survive. So why is it so hard to move to a deregulated market? You have resistance from investor-owned utilities. Duke Energy would fight this tooth and nail. They're afraid that a lot of their assets, like their coal power plants, will be uneconomical. They'll be stranded assets, that they'll lose the value on those assets. They'll also lose some of the most profitable parts of their business, the distribution side. So from a shareholder perspective, they'd lose an incredible amount of value if you went ahead and deregulated, took a natural monopolist and deregulated their market. The California experience that I mentioned in the early part of the 21st century um, created a chill that lasted more than a decade with regards to deregulation. After the California blow up, no other state wanted to touch deregulation. And then another problem going against it is that politicians fear the backlash that's going to occur when prices initially go up. And I'll also mention investor-owned utilities are powerful. They will punish politicians who push deregulation by bankrolling opposition to them. So there are many things working against deregulation. Okay, I want to just also another path dependency, and that is the end of World War II, we started to build really inefficient houses. If you look at houses before World War II, they were really well built. During the Great Depression, we also developed technology to build passive solar homes, so super efficient homes that could stay warm and cool with very little energy. But after World War II, we thought that the price of electricity was going to be negligible. People thought that nuclear power would be so cheap to produce that people would pay a single price for all the electricity they could consume. So basically, you would just pay a flat fee to be connected to the grid every month. Let's say $10 a month or $5 a month, and you could consume as much electricity as you want. So that gave rise to the all-electric home. And this is Ready Kilowatt was an advertising slogan used for 40 years in the US, basically to promote the use of electricity in electrical appliances. One of the most interesting PR lines was that it was good for women, that the more electricity you had, the less women were going to have to work, and this would issue in a golden era of leisure for women. Actually, studies showed it just raised the bar. If it was easier to clean the house, you could clean it all the time and make it spick and span. But this was some of the things that were being pushed by utility companies to convince Americans to buy more appliances and use more energy. Often, too, an important thing was they managed to convince government that houses should come fully loaded with all the appliances and could be built into the mortgage. So, if you're a young couple and you don't have to worry about buying a dishwasher and a dryer because it's built into your mortgage, you're more likely to have those appliances. So a few of the negative things, term you need to know are split incentives. Part of the reason why our housing stock is so energy inefficient is because of these split incentives. A home builder just wants to sell you a house for as much as he or she can. They're going to focus on the visual appeal. They do not make money by building the house so that there's not a lot of leaks, so that it has good insulation. Once they give you the keys, the life cycle cost of the house is not their problem, it's yours. This is the same thing for apartments that are rented out. The landlord does not pay the utilities, the renter does. So the landlord has no incentive to make a home efficient. So these split incentives often call for a policy response, but often we don't. Very few states we've seen strong policy responses. California is a notable exception that's moving towards a zero net energy landscape first for residential homes and then for commercial buildings. Electricity, I mentioned already, too cheap to meter. I mentioned we had good ideas on how to develop really energy efficient buildings as early as the Great Depression, things like double pane windows, how to develop a really architecturally easy to copy passive solar home. Instead, we went in a completely opposite direction. We took regional architectural styles like southern orientation in northern Minnesota with windows in the facing south and almost no windows in the north, lower ceilings facing north, or deep south where you had high ceilings, wraparound porches to keep some of the heat and humidity, the sunlight out of the house. After World War II, we started building homes that were identical, where you would see the same house being built in northern Minnesota or southern Louisiana. So we completely disregarded regional architectural styles that had an important efficiency component to them. So how are we going to change our electric system? We've been toying with this idea now for 60 years. The old model began to lose its legitimacy really late 50s, 1960s. One of the things that happens when you give any business a monopoly is you get technological stagnation. And that was beginning to be recognized, not so much in the 50s, but in the 60s when people figured out that you could use the same technology for jet engines, that you could use this to burn gas really efficiently in these new, very efficient engines that essentially was moving technology from one area to the other. And so people were chomping at the bit to produce gas plants because they could do it cheaper than these large power plants, coal and nuclear plants that utilities were building, but they were blocked from doing it. So that produced a lot of resentment. The fact that you could do these smaller gas plants that were cheaper also put an end to the idea of bigger is better. For most of the history of this, the old model, utilities wanted to build bigger and bigger coal and nuclear plants. And natural gas technology, as it developed in the late 60s and 1970s, showed that this was an incorrect assumption. Environmental concerns were the first that really kicked in. People began to realize that the biggest source of pollution was usually how we were producing energy. And people wanted to see something done about the pollution that energy production was causing. There was growing evidence that the natural monopoly model was economically harmful, that it was making us pay more for energy than we had to, making American manufacturing less competitive. And finally, in the 1970s, we had this total ideological shift away from regulation and government towards markets and deregulation. And in the 70s, we saw the deregulation of the telephone company. Prior to the mid-70s, there was a single AT&T telephone company that had a monopoly on all long distance and most local telephones business, and Congress broke that up and created competition. Congress didn't go that far with electricity. It did create PURPA, the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act. PURPA allowed a qualified facility to sell electricity to a utility, including an investor-owned utility. It obligated, let's say, a Duke Energy to buy from a gas power plant energy at what was called avoided cost. So if the monopolist was saying that this is what it would cost to produce additional energy and someone could come along and produce it at that price, they were obligated to buy that electricity. Nobody knew in 1978 that this would open the door for renewables, but PURPA has been a really important piece of policy that has allowed the growth of renewable energy developers to spring up around the country. And it then has required companies like Duke to buy that energy from a company like Strata at avoided cost. This has now become very controversial, and there's been tweaks to PURPA, and there are forces that want to eliminate PURPA. But this has been very important for the advance of renewable energy in the US. Another thing about bigger is no longer better is utilities are stuck once they make a big bet. They have long amortization periods, so to get the value out of a resource. And even though, for example, today Trump is pushing coal, no utility is jumping to build new coal plants because they know at some point he'll be gone. And if you get something like carbon pricing or cap and trade, they will have wasted money. And they can just see that from a market perspective, coal is no longer competitive today, even less so in the future. So energy and the environment, big one today is climate change. Back in the 60s, it was air pollution. People also had big concerns about nuclear power. 3 Mile Island pretty much brought an end to the growth of nuclear power in the US. 3 Mile Island, you can read about it. It was an accident. Fortunately, it didn't get out of control like Chernobyl, but it certainly was bad enough to really scare people. I want to shift to one last topic and I'll end, and that's subsidies. We have subsidies for fossil fuels that have been on the books since the decade of the 1910s, so more than 100 years now. You go back to the beginning of the semester, you can justify a subsidy to help create a new industry. Fossil fuel industry today is the very definition of a mature industry. It should not require subsidies, especially now that there's competition. So I'm not going to go over all these subsidies like the oil depletion allowance. There's a link here that you can access, that you can look at this long slew of subsidies. And these are just the direct subsidies. There are huge indirect subsidies that go to fossil fuel. So one of those is the damage that the use of fossil fuels does to our environment and our public health. They are a huge reason why a lot of people have respiratory problems, yet they are allowed to get away with these negative externalities. And actions that government has taken in the past to force them to internalize some of these negative externalities has basically been undone the past 3 years. Fossil fuels also get a huge subsidy in terms of the US acting like the global oil policeman. US spends billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars to keep fleet in and around the Persian Gulf to make sure that oil never stops coming through the Gulf. This arrangement goes all the way back to World War II when Franklin Roosevelt entered an agreement with Ibn Saud, the head of king of Saudi Arabia, saying that if anything was ever to threaten the House of Saud, the United States would come to Saudi Arabia's aid, or I should say the aid of the House of Saud. So even if there was a civil war, we would side with the House of Saud. And we have kept military assets there. Now it's the Fifth Fleet, and that costs us billions of dollars a year. I also want to say that these subsidies are not all from the past. Ohio just passed a bill to subsidize uneconomical coal plants. This is just bizarro in a world of climate change. I mean, this is the opposite of a carbon tax. This is where you're basically using taxpayer money to cause climate change, because these coal plants are not only not necessary, they're uneconomical, they're uncompetitive. So in terms of the big subsidy, there is a group called Securing America's Future Energy, SAFE. It's a think tank of very conservative people, retired generals, admirals, and current CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. They estimate that in 2018, the US spent $81 billion to secure our oil supply. It's a 28-cent subsidy on every gallon of gas. So if we weren't investing in Fifth Fleet, basically, the insecurity caused by global oil supply would, according to their analysis, add 28 cents to a gallon of gas. Um, and from a cost-benefit analysis, what they pointed out is the U.S. government values the cost of defending oil at $0. That this is just something the taxpayers are going to do just because it's the idea we need this energy to survive. And that was true in the past. It's not true today. If we wanted to wean ourselves of the liquid fuel that's coming out of the Persian Gulf, we could promote electric cars and produce the electricity domestically. This is now a trap that we can get out of, but we seem unwilling to get out of. This security quagmire is a huge cost of our really imaginative energy supply. It's a failure to imagine that we can do things differently. It's a huge cost. It also comes with high moral costs where we've tied ourselves to very unsavory regimes, all under the guise that we cannot survive without, the global economy could not survive without this oil coming out of the Persian Gulf region. But the good news is that electrification of transportation is coming. In a few years, it's going to be as cost competitive. It's going to with fossil fuels. So this is a transition that we need to make and certainly can make with no economic damage. This deals with the moral compromises made by our dependency on Persian Gulf oil. And again, this is coming from SAFE. These are former generals, admirals, and current leaders of major companies. Right, with that, I'd like to end this lecture, and we will be doing 2 more lectures on kind of Energy 101.